Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, November 7th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Gaza death toll surpasses 10,000. So Gaza's health ministry said Monday that after 31 days of relentless Israeli airstrikes, the death toll in the besieged enclave has surpassed 10,000, and that total includes over 4,000 children. So the U.S. has cast doubt on the accuracy of the numbers coming from Gaza's health ministry, but UN officials have said they believe the real death toll is actually much higher due to the number of people stuck under the rubble. And the UN actually said on Monday that about 2,260 people in Gaza have been reported missing, and they're presumed to be stuck under the rubble, either alive or dead. And that number includes 1,270 children. So over 1,000 children under the rubble, potentially under the rubble. I mean, it's a really horrific thing to think about. The Israeli newspaper Yediot Aharonot cited an Israeli security source who actually put the death toll much higher. So this is interesting. And again, this is an Israeli official speaking anonymously to this newspaper, but I thought this was significant enough to include. This official said that he believes the Israeli military has actually killed 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza. So far, I haven't seen that number backed up by another source, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Monday called for an end to the onslaught on Gaza, saying that the enclave has become a graveyard for children. He said, quote, "We must act now to find a way out of this brutal, awful, agonizing dead end of destruction. Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children. Hundreds of girls and boys are reportedly being killed or injured every day," end quote. So this massive death toll and child casualties has not impacted U.S. support for Israel's campaign. As I covered yesterday, U.S. officials have been, kind of paying lip service to the idea of minimizing civilian casualties, but they're not actually doing anything. They're not leveraging aid. They're not threatening to cut Israel off or anything like that. So the next story here, State Department officials slam Biden's Israel policy. So this is interesting to see. State Department staffers have slammed President Biden's full-throated support for Israel's bombardment of Gaza in a dissent memo. So this memo was obtained by Politico, and the Politico report said that the blistering critique of Biden's handling of the war reflects the sentiments of many U.S. diplomats in the State Department, especially at the middle and lower levels. So HuffPost previously reported that a mutiny was brewing within the State Department. So there's a lot of signs that, dissent is growing within the State Department at least. So one request that was made in this memo is for the U.S. to support a ceasefire in Gaza. The Biden administration has been calling for a humanitarian pause, but they've refused to use the term ceasefire, I think because they don't want to show Israel that they have any second thoughts about supporting this war. So I guess ceasefire just sounds more official and long-term, so they're just calling for these little pauses. So this memo also calls on the Biden administration to publicly criticize Israel's military tactics and treatment of Palestinians. So the memo says that the lack of public comments critiquing Israel, quote, contributes to regional public perceptions that the United States is a biased and dishonest actor, which at best does not advance and at worst harms U.S. interests worldwide, end quote. So I thought that was an interesting quote there. And they go on to say in pretty strong terms that the U.S. must criticize Israel's, killing of civilians and what settlers are doing in the West Bank by seizing land and pushing Palestinians out of their homes. And the memo criticizes the U.S. for accepting the high civilian casualty rate in Israel's bombardment, saying that doing so, quote, engenders doubt in the rules-based international order that we have long championed, end quote. So it's kind of funny to see because you had for the past year and a half, since Russia invaded Ukraine, you've had the Biden administration lecturing everybody about this so-called rules-based order, which is just, means the U.S.-dominated world order. A lot of countries around the world have viewed this from the perspective of the U.S. being the world empire and, invading Iraq early in the 2000s and all the other wars that it was involved with in the Middle East and North Africa. So the U.S. just looks very hypocritical when lecturing Russia, and now even more so when backing this really brutal air campaign and invasion of Gaza. So according to Politico, it's unclear how many people signed the memo or if it was submitted to the State Department's dissent channel. And that was a channel that was created during the Vietnam War. So diplomats in the State Department could criticize policy. And the idea of it was that they could do it privately and not have to worry about repercussions. But this Politico report had an interesting line that basically said this memo is unlikely to get far with Biden or his top aides. So they're basically saying, yeah, you have this dissent at the middle and lower levels of the State Department, but up top, they're all in on supporting this war. So the next one here, Israel continues to rebuff U.S. calls for a humanitarian pause. So the U.S. has nothing to show for its calls for a temporary pause in Israel's onslaught on Gaza, as the Israeli military says that it's cut off North Gaza from the south and a new phase of heavy ground fighting is expected. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken was rebuffed when he visited Israel on Friday and called for a humanitarian pause. President Biden spoke with Netanyahu on Monday, and the White House said that he discussed the idea of a tactical pause, but there's no sign that Netanyahu agreed or is even thinking about doing something like that. So White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said that the U.S. was at the beginning of the conversation with Israel related to this idea of a pause. He said, quote, "So you can expect that we're going to continue to advocate for a temporary, localized pauses in the fighting," end quote. So temporary, localized pauses. So that might just mean, stopping airstrikes in a certain area at a certain time to get more aid in that area or to get people out. But again, they're not using the C word, which is ceasefire. So if you're watching here, you could see the map from South Front of the situation on the battlefield in Gaza, and Israel has cut off, separated North Gaza, which includes Gaza City, from the rest of the enclave, and they're saying that they're going to go into Gaza City. Now, that is going to be, there's probably very heavy fighting already happening on the ground. It's not really clear. There's not too many reports about what's actually happening on the ground, but if Israeli ground troops really push into Gaza City, they're going to face very stiff resistance from Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other militant groups. It's going to be a serious fight, and it looks like they are moving in that direction, but still, it doesn't seem like quite yet they're going to be entering the city, but they're saying they're still, really hitting the city with airstrikes. Some reports I saw from Monday said that people were describing the airstrikes that day as some of the heaviest yet. So that's what I guess they're still trying to do, is soften it up with the airstrikes, even though the rubble can create, more hiding spots and things. And you have Hamas, they have those deep tunnels. So it's just going to be a very tough fight for the Israelis once they actually go in there. And according to AP, hundreds of thousands of people are still in northern Gaza. The Israeli military says that there is a one-way evacuation corridor for people to leave, but many are afraid to use that route. Other people that have gone south have been bombed. Once they got south, there's been convoys that were bombed. So they're definitely have reason to be worried. And I'm sure that they're also worried about the impending big fight in Gaza City. And Israeli airstrikes have continued to pound the area, hitting hospitals, UN shelters, refugee camps, and ambulances in recent days. Israel has also continued to bomb southern Gaza despite telling Palestinians to flee to that area. All right, so the next one here, Israeli doctors urge the bombing of Gaza hospitals. So this article is from Mondo Weiss. About 90 Israeli doctors signed a letter calling for the bombing of hospitals in Gaza. Only last week, dozens of prominent Israeli rabbis had already assured Israeli leaders that they have the right to bomb Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza. And this week's letter, signed by a group that calls itself Doctors for the Rights of IDF Soldiers, urges the bombing of any and every hospital in Gaza. The letter states in no uncertain terms that due to suspicion of terrorist activity, the hospitals are a legitimate target for annihilation. They claim that, quote, ambulances that are evacuating patients to the south in order to be treated elsewhere are at their disposal, end quote. So that was on Friday. There was airstrikes against hospitals that they were loading up with people to evacuate. Israel claimed Hamas was using the ambulances. So it's just strange to see a group of doctors saying, go ahead, bomb these healthcare facilities, bomb the hospitals. They're all terrorists, or the argument, I guess, is that Hamas is using these as bases where they have tunnels underneath. That's the claim from Israel. And I know that I think some hospital directors have said to send in international observers to come look to see, so we could show you that Hamas is not using these hospitals as bases. And I know that Al-Shifa Hospital is packed full of people. And I mean, if they have been bombing around it, but if they really hit that hospital, I mean, they could kill a lot of people. So the doctors claim that the residents of Gaza are the ones who brought their annihilation upon themselves. So pretty serious letter here. And the doctors apply the terms snakes, wasps, and terrorist nests in the dehumanization of the enemy, which appears to be expanded from Hamas to the whole of the Palestinian people. And that's rhetoric that you see. It's not just from the fringes in Israel. We're seeing this type of rhetoric from Israeli MPs, that minister in Netanyahu's coalition who said nuking Gaza was an option. People actually within the government say things like this as well. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to transfer $320 million in precision bomb kits to Israel. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Monday that the Biden administration is planning a $320 million transfer of precision-guided bomb kits to Israel. And this is a big show of support for what they are doing in Gaza. So the report said the administration notified congressional leaders on October 31st, and they said that they intended to transfer Spice family gliding bomb assemblies, which is a equipment that turns unguided bombs that are dropped out of airplanes into precision-guided munitions. So the bombs will be transferred from weapons manufacturer Rafael USA to its Israeli parent company, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems. So it's unclear where the U.S. is getting the funds for this transfer, or if Israel's actually purchasing this equipment. That wasn't clear from this Wall Street Journal report. And so the New York Times reported it as a sale, but the actual letter doesn't indicate that it's a sale. It just says it's a transfer. So this could potentially be using military aid that Israel does get each year. They get $3.8 billion, and some of that includes foreign military financing, which is a form of aid that the U.S. gives foreign governments to buy U.S. weapons. So it's possible they're using that for this, but it's not really clear. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're just making money appear to continue funding, shipping weapons to Israel. So because the Biden administration is looking for $14 billion in additional military aid for Israel that's been hung up in Congress with the Republicans trying to pass that as a solo package, while the Democrats want to roll in, all this aid for Ukraine, Taiwan, and other stuff. And right after the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, the U.S. began immediately shipping new military equipment to Israel. And according to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon has refused to say how much weaponry, equipment, and other types of aid that it has provided Israel since October 7th. So there's a big question of how are they paying for this? I know they have $100 million available in what they call the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to send weapons straight from Pentagon stockpiles. So they had about $100 million of that available for Israel. But, I mean, if they've been shipping weapons as much as it seems they are, like the Pentagon has said there's been shipments going out every day, I think they've probably burned through that. And besides this material support, the U.S. is flying drones over Gaza, has special operations forces in Israel, and has deployed an enormous amount of firepower to the region. So just shows how involved the U.S. is in this war. All right, so the next one here, some of the consequences of U.S. involvement in this war. U.S. forces attacked 38 times in Syria and Iraq since October 17th. So more drones and rockets were fired at U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria on Sunday and Monday, bringing the total number of attacks on U.S. troops since October 17th to 38. So if you remember yesterday, I said the number was 32, so there was 6 attacks. That's a kind of a big uptick on Sunday and Monday, and you can see another map from South Front here that shows the different areas where these attacks took place in Syria and Iraq. So this seems to be kind of more coordinated than the other ones. And Pentagon officials said on Monday that so far at least 45 U.S. troops have been injured in all of these attacks. No deaths yet. There was a contractor on one of the bases who died of a heart attack during a shelter-in-place warning when they thought that the base was under attack. I don't think we know the nationality of that contractor, but so the total number of injuries is more than twice what the Pentagon has previously reported. The U.S. military is monitoring about 24 U.S. service members who may be suffering from traumatic brain injuries due to the attacks. So on October 27th, the U.S. launched airstrikes in eastern Syria, and they said one purpose was to deter more attacks on U.S. bases. But since then, there's been 19 more attacks on U.S. bases in the region. And most of these are being claimed by an umbrella group of militias that calls itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. And we know the U.S. is blaming Iran. Iran does support these militias, but we don't know if they are actually directing the attacks. But the U.S. is pointing the finger at Iran. And, some Iranian officials have issued some warnings to the U.S. Their defense minister said on Sunday that the U.S. should end the war in Gaza, implement a ceasefire, or else the U.S. will be hit hard, is how he put it. And notice the rhetoric, and this is important to understand, to what these, opponents of Israel's war in Gaza in the region are, view it as an American war as well. And how could they not when you look at all the deployments that the U.S. has done and just all the support that the U.S. supplies Israel in general. So, as long as the U.S. keeps supporting this thing, the risk of this turning into a big regional war, the risk of these American troops that are stationed in Syria and Iraq dying just continues to increase. It's just one of the many reasons why the U.S. should not be involved in this conflict and not be supporting Israel the way it is. All right. So the next one here, U.S. nuclear-powered submarine is in the Middle East. So the U.S. military announced on Sunday that a U.S. nuclear-powered submarine was in the Middle East in the latest provocation aimed at warning regional actors against attacking Israel or U.S. forces. So U.S. Central Command said that an Ohio-class submarine entered the region without offering any details. A U.S. Navy spokesperson later told Business Insider that the submarine was a guided missile submarine which can carry 154 Tomahawk missiles. So it's got a lot of firepower, but it is not a ballistic missile submarine, and those are the ones that are armed with nuclear warheads. But still provocative nonetheless, and this submarine just represents another one of these deployments. And the thing about the submarines is that they're designed to be stealthy. The whole idea of them is that they could be they patrol waters all over the world, but nobody knows where they are, and they have very long-range missiles, especially the ballistic missile submarines. So they can hit targets from thousands of miles away. The only reason to announce where they are is if you want to say, hey, look it up. If you want to send a threat, if you want to, send a threatening message. So that's what the U.S. is doing here. Just like Biden recently docked a nuclear-armed submarine in South Korea. And that was the first time the U.S. has done that since the 1980s. And the only purpose of that was to say, hey, look, North Korea. Hey, look, China. We have nukes here. Just an insane provocation, for no other reason than to, send a threat. All right. So the next one here, Zelensky says that elections are not appropriate at this time. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So Zelensky explained that he is opposed to holding elections in 2024. The Ukrainian leader claimed that his government would be unable to hold elections due to the ongoing war. So Zelensky was elected to a 5-year term in 2019, and Ukraine is due to hold its next presidential election next year. Ukraine has been under martial law since Russia invaded in February 2022, and according to Ukraine's constitution, Ukrainian law prohibits elections during martial law. But Zelensky has actually previously said, if you give us enough money, we'll hold elections. He was saying he wanted the West to fund the elections. So it showed that there is flexibility when it comes to the law. But now he's basically saying, no, we're not going to have elections. He said, quote, "We all understand that now in wartime, when there are many challenges, it is utterly irresponsible to engage in topics related to an election in such a frivolous manner. We need to recognize that this is a time for defense, a time for battle, upon which the fate of the state and its people depend. I believe that elections are not appropriate at this time," end quote. So seems to be putting to bed the idea of holding an election. I guess, they weren't offering him enough cash to do it. All right, so I left the one up about the U.S. actually discussing the idea of peace talks with Ukraine because that is a big story. And then the last one here, China hits back at Canada over an encounter in the South China Sea. So this is an area that I try to keep an eye on. I've been kind of failing at covering the China stuff lately with all the stuff going on with Gaza. But the South China Sea is an area we need to keep our eyes on because there's a lot of U.S. and Chinese military activity. They have a lot of encounters, and some of the U.S.'s allies are getting in on the action, including Canada. So Beijing hit back at Ottawa over a mid-air encounter between a Canadian aircraft and PLA fighter jets over the South China Sea late last month, describing the Canadian action as provocative. So China's defense ministry spokesman said on Saturday that a Canadian helicopter conducted flights of unknown intent to approach the airspace around the Paracel Islands, which are disputed islands in the South China Sea. I mean, what's a Canadian helicopter doing over there? So the spokesman said that the People's Liberation Army's naval and air forces had identified the Canadian helicopter and repeatedly issued warnings, but that it refused to respond and took provocative actions such as flying at ultra-low altitude. So the Canadian flight represented malicious and provocative actions, according to the Chinese side. And Beijing's response came after Canada accused the Chinese Air Force of unsafe behavior over international waters in the South China Sea. on October 29th. So this is Canada first accused the Chinese side of being doing the unsafe things and being provocative. They said that one of their helicopters was conducting routine exercises in the South China Sea. It's just routine for a Canadian helicopter to be flying over the South China Sea. And it was intercepted by two Chinese fighter jets. It said that one jet conducted a pass over the Canadian helicopter with little separation, causing the helicopter to experience turbulence. And later that day, another fighter aircraft launched flares directly in front of the Canadian helicopter. So we are seeing more and more incidents like this happen. I do think it is China showing that they are very fed up with the amount of U.S. and other Western military activity, in the South China Sea near Taiwan. It's a very sensitive area for China, and the U.S. flies a lot of planes. I know last year, 2022, the U.S. flew at least 1,000 surveillance flights just over the South China Sea. So it just gives you an idea of the scale of the U.S. Military presence there and what is a very sensitive area for China. And if you know anything about China, they're not just going to back down because these Western countries are sending their military to the region. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ron Paul. Don't worry, it's not foreign aid, it's corporate welfare. We have one from Ted Snyder. Ukraine has lost the war. One from Liz Theo-Harris. America's war economy and the urgent call for peace in the Middle East. One from Adam Sewer. Don't equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And one from John Hoffman. The U.S. is barreling toward another war in the Middle East. That is it for me for today. You could always support this show by sharing, telling your friends about antiwar.com. Subscribe on YouTube or Rumble, Odyssey, wherever you prefer to watch. If you listen to the audio podcast, you could leave a rating or a review, depending on where you listen to it. Follow me on Twitter at DeCampDave. Follow antiwar.com. That's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.